I want to start by just focusing a little bit on temper outbursts, because temper outbursts are one of the things that families find really difficult, and that sort of difficulty has driven a lot of our research. So I'm going to show you a clip of an actress who worked with us based on accounts that families had given us and our observations of the kinds of behaviours that typically happen during temper outbursts, and she's just acted out a sort of typical temper outburst based on those accounts.
He said you were going to stop. He said you were going to stop. I can go to the party. He said to go to the party. I want to go to the party. I need it. I haven't got anyone. You never let me do anything.
So, of course, temper outbursts are really emotional, and I think that's one of the things that makes them so difficult for individuals and for family members. This is just a research study that I've recently been involved with collaborating in Australia, actually. Jennifer mentioned Stuart Einfeld. So basically what we're doing is just talking about temper outbursts with people, and what the triggers of those temper outbursts are, and you can see that changes to routines, plans and expectations are one of the most common triggers of temper outbursts. So more than 9 in every 10 respondents told us that changes to routines and expectations can trigger temper outbursts. So what do we mean by change to a routine, plan or expectation? A really common example that I've heard a lot would be if little Billy normally goes to school on the school bus with Bob, the bus driver, but if Bob, the bus driver, is ill, then Bill, the bus driver, turns up instead. And that's a really risky situation for when Bobby might have a very big temper outburst, perhaps so big that he couldn't actually get on the school bus to go to school. That sort of change triggering a temper outburst fits into a wider profile that we know about of resistance to change in people with Prader-Willi Syndrome. So we see a lot of preoccupation about what's going to happen. So restricted conversation about what is going to happen, when is it going to happen, why are we going to do this, when are we going to do this, and a lot of repetitive questions that increase when things change in routines, and also this sort of rigidity in thinking. And so all of that feeds into this picture of changes being really difficult for individuals with Prader-Willi Syndrome. And some of our previous research, which I've talked about before at these conferences, tried to parse out what the effects of just changes on their own are on behaviour, so that we could see, okay, if we can show that there's a relationship between just a change happening and a profile of difficult behaviour, then we would know that then if we can find a way to deal with the unpredictability of the change, then that could help us deal with the behaviour. And so ultimately that research that we've done before did show that although there's lots of things that feed into the behaviour, changes to routines and plans and expectations is one really important factor. So if we can find ways to deal with those difficulties with change, then that could be potentially helpful in dealing with a range of behaviours. And so I want to talk about, we've developed a fair few strategies, and I want to start off by talking about perhaps the most simple strategy, which is based on tried and tested behavioural learning principles. So in this strategy, all we're doing is trying to make the change more predictable. And we can do that by making an association between something that signals the change that happens before the change, and then the fact that a change is definitely going to happen after that signal. So to give you an example of that, I'm going to play you a video, and it's got a few loud, nasty noises. So if you've got sensitive hearing, you might want to just cover your ears. So the idea there was, hopefully, the third time you heard the sound, it wasn't quite so nasty as the first time you heard it. Because in the first 3 times you saw this yellow noise sign, and that warned you, okay, I'm going to hear a sound, and you should have learned that association, even with those 3 pairings. And then the third time you saw the yellow noise sign and you heard the noise, hopefully it wasn't quite so bad as the first time you heard the noise. And then maybe then the last time when you saw the yellow noise sign and I didn't play the noise, maybe you felt a bit surprised. So ultimately this warning system works in the same kind of way, except we have a much longer learning period for the individual to learn, okay, this signal means something is going to change, and it's definitely going to change. So as soon as I see this signal, I know 100% something is going to change, so that change is more predictable for me. So we use this strategy with a small group of people just to see, okay, if we look at particular changes to this person's routines, can we make a behaviour response to a change in that routine less problematic if we use the signal? And we showed that for a small number, so it was within sort of more than 5, less than 10 people, we could show that certain changes we could make easier to deal with this signal card. So then we moved into a larger trial where we were looking at this signalling strategy compared to another strategy. And we built web-based resources to teach caregivers how to use this strategy or the other strategy, and then we wanted them to use it at home with the individuals that they care for. These were actually all children between the ages of 6 and 16. So I'll just show you a quick video that was part of one of the training resources to just help caregivers to think about how to use the strategy with their children.
Okay, thanks for letting me know, Jenny. Bye. Bye-bye. Sarah, I need to talk to you for a minute.
Okay.
Something's going to change.
Okay.
Remember you were going to Katie's birthday party tomorrow?
Yeah?
Well, her granny's sick, so they can't have the party tomorrow anymore.
So does that mean I'm not going to Katie's party tomorrow?
No, you're not going to the party, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay.
Okay, well thank you for understanding. I'm really proud of you.
So that was one of the videos in our training resources, and we compared then the signalling strategy to another strategy which is also really simple. It just involves basically planning ahead to try to avoid as many changes as possible and communicating those plans to the individual with PWS using visual aids, so either a visual schedule or a phone-based visual applications. But importantly, of course, it's not possible to plan everything. Stuff will change. So we wanted families to include in their plans alternative options for times when they know that the plan is actually quite likely to change. So if we think about the bus driver example, if you know that changing bus driver can often be problematic, then there wouldn't just be one bus driver option on the plan, there would be more than one bus driver option on the plan. So the child would know from the start that yes, it's typically Bill the bus driver, but sometimes it can be Bob the bus driver, and perhaps sometimes it can be Peter the bus driver, but they'll have the whole series of eventualities in the plan from the start. And what we want to do was try to compare those two strategies because they should work for different reasons and in different ways. The signalling card should make changes easier to deal with if they happen because the change itself is more predictable, but the planning ahead wouldn't have any impact on changes that happen, but it should allow the family to reduce some of the unexpected changes. So we did this with a large group of people, some of whom had PWS and some of whom had other neurodevelopmental disorders, but all who showed this sort of resistance to change. And we asked families to record behaviour over a long baseline period, so about 6 months, using a web-based behaviour diary. And then we gave them access to one of the two different behavioural strategies. And the way the web-based training worked is that it built up from a very easy level for both the caregiver and importantly for the child to understand, and then over a 4-week period it gradually built on that learning. Importantly, for example, with the signal card, it's critical that the child learns that the signal is not always bad. So to start off with, the card has to be used in fun, game-like settings or with deliberately positive changes so that the child learns that, yes, this card signals change, but it's not always bad change. So if I see the card, it could be something good that's going to happen. And that's really important, and that's why we built it up gradually. And then following having access to those strategies, we then asked parents and carers to record the behaviour again over another 6 months. The results were really quite variable. We saw quite a lot of drop-off over the course of the study, and I want to mention that in a minute because there's a few important reasons why that might be. But in terms of outcomes for individual families, it seemed that different families responded, some of them responded to each strategy and some of them didn't, and there was quite a lot of variability with that. And based on what families told us in their feedback, it seems that different elements of each strategy may be more or less useful at different times for a particular family. So it might be useful to actually have access to both strategies. You can see that, for example, one family who used a signalling strategy found it really helpful and carried on using it, but that wasn't the case with everyone who used a signalling strategy. In terms of sort of group outcomes, I don't think we could draw a lot from the overall global comparison of the two groups in terms of saying one strategy was better than another, but it did teach us really important lessons going forward. One of the important lessons was actually in this long 6-month baseline recording period, several families told us that just thinking about the behaviours in the way that we'd asked them to record them, so we asked them to record when the behaviour happened, what happened before it, and what happened afterwards. And they told us that just doing that allowed them to think themselves about their own management strategies that they were trying to apply in the home anyway. And actually several families noticed that the behaviour dropped off during that 6-line baseline period. And so several families actually pulled out the study of that at that time because they didn't feel the need for the strategies. Of course, it wasn't anywhere near everyone, but it's important to think about because that could mean that just recording behaviour in a very simple way could be helpful. And one of the things that we've done since then is develop an even simpler web-based behaviour diary that allows you to record behaviour and then keep track. You can keep just going onto a web page and looking at everything that you've entered and keep track of that behaviour. But really importantly, several families said to us, look, these strategies, and this is particularly the older children, so those say between 12 and 16, the parents told us that if they'd have known about these strategies much earlier in the child's life, then potentially they could have been really helpful. But right now they felt that they'd already sort of learned all this through trial and error, and actually they probably already had slightly more sophisticated ways of doing it within their family context, and so they didn't feel that they were learning anything from our strategies. Or perhaps they just looked at, say, the first simple week of the training and then decided actually no, it wasn't for them, and they didn't get past that to look at the more sort of complex stuff later on. So I think that's really important, and one of the things we're doing now is working towards an early intervention strategy, which I'm going to come on and talk to you about at the end of the talk. So, moving on then, we've talked about some simple behaviour strategies that could help manage the resistance to change, but what are the things that make change really difficult for people with PWS? And when we were thinking about that, one of the categories of things that we wanted to think about is cognitive processes or brain processes. Because if we could identify cognitive processes that are important in dealing with change, then that could open another potential route to intervention. And it turns out that this cognitive process called task switching is really important for dealing with change. So task switching is basically thinking about things flexibly. So it's changing from thinking about something in one way to thinking about that same thing in a different way. So the reason the egg cups are on the slide is that if you've got a boiled egg and a spoon and you need to eat the egg, you have to start off thinking about the spoon as like a hammer type implement that's capable of breaking the shell of the egg. And then if you want to eat the egg, you have to switch how you're thinking about the spoon and think about it as a sort of concave implement that's capable of scooping the yolk out of the egg. So you're changing how you're thinking about the spoon, and that's what task switching is. So just to bring the example home, and I've done these examples before, but if anyone's been here previous years, I've changed up the examples, so hopefully you won't guess. This is just an example of what task switching is. So what you need to do is answer the question on the top of the slide. So here it is the top person young or old? And you have to call out one of the numbers at the bottom. So here, the top person is young, so you have to call out the number 1 that's next to the young person. Does that make sense? Can we try that now? Brilliant. Try again.
1, 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 1, 2, 1.
Oh, but that was a switch because I'd sneakily changed the question, and now the question is the top person male or female? So then the answer is, the top person is female, so the answer should have been 2. So you've had to change how you're thinking about those cartoon characters. So of course switching is difficult for all of us, and we probably all find change quite difficult, so we can appreciate it. But what we know with people with Prader-Willi Syndrome is that actually switching is really difficult, and the neural pathways that are responsible for switching actually function in a completely different way in people with Prader-Willi Syndrome. So one of the things that we wanted to do then is think, okay, if this task switching and I guess the key thing to mention here, which is critical and I almost forgot, is that if children that have, or individuals that have more difficulties with task switching show more resistance to change. So that suggests that the task switching is linked to the resistance to change. And if we do an experimental type design where we ask people to do exercises like the one that I just showed you, to put demands on their task switching, and we watch what happens to behaviour, then we can see that behaviour difficulties actually increase. So the kinds of behaviours that people show in a resistance to change setting actually increase. So we've got this relationship between task switching problems and resistance to change. So if we know that relationship exists, if we can improve task switching by training, then we could potentially reduce resistance to change and associated behaviour problems. And that's exactly what we wanted to do in our taster video game training study. In that study, what we were doing is trying to build a video game to train task switching. And it turns out that certain video games are actually already quite good at doing that. And I'm going to play a really brief clip of one of those kinds of games that is good at it. Games that are already quite good at training task switching share some key characteristics. They're really exciting. So when you're watching that video, maybe your heart started racing, probably because it's a bit loud, but your heart does start racing. They're built to be exciting. They're also built to be extremely adaptive because the video game companies want anyone to be able to play them, from expert players that have played for hundreds of hours right down to people like me who've never played that kind of game before. So they're really, really adaptive, and of course they're really motivating. That's why they're commercially successful. So what we wanted to do in our video game was to build those principles into it. We wanted to build a game that's exciting, motivating, and really adaptive. So one of the ways we tried to do that was to collaborate with individuals with PWS and their families to build the game based on their preferences. So these are just the results from a very early preference test that we did, where we found we got people to play different games and then looked at which ones they preferred and why, and then built that into a picture of their preferences. And some important preferences were actually it's better to play on a tablet computer rather than, say, a desktop or laptop computer with a mouse. That's really important for us to know. But also children seem to prefer games where you have to control a character on the screen and where you have to collect things. Obviously that might fit into the broader profile that we know about of collecting. Some people with Prader-Willi Syndrome like collecting. So we built a really early prototype, I keep going the wrong way, prototype of our game where it involves task switching as a key element, but it's built to children's preferences. So you have to control a character on the screen and you have to collect things. But the key thing is that although you're always collecting good creatures, which creatures are good change at different times. So you have to collect good creatures but avoid bad creatures, but at different times during play there will be one type of creatures that's good and a different type of creatures that are bad, and then that will switch. And that's how we put the key demands on task switching. So I'll show you a clip of this really early prototype just so you can get an idea. So you saw that there was just one switch there. It started off collecting a red thing and then it switched to blue. Now, that was really, I mean, you could see how basic that prototype was, but importantly, we managed to get it to a stage where it could motivate a small number of people to play. Actually, these were all children in the first stage of study. They played for maximum of a couple of hours over several weeks, so it was about 10 minutes at a time over about 4 weeks, so every few days, playing a little bit. And it was a very small placebo-controlled crossover trial where we built a different version of the game that didn't put demands on switching, and we tried to make sure that everyone played both versions of the game at different times. And we found in that very small study evidence to suggest that just playing that prototype for that short amount of time could improve performance on the kinds of task switching tests like the demonstration that I did with the boy and the girl earlier. So although of course we didn't know what the significance of those improvements in performance on the task switching test would be, because we don't know what meaning that has in real life, that was really important because it told us, look, you're on the right track. Even with this initial prototype, it seems that you can have a positive effect on task switching. So then that gave us the license, and importantly the money that we got from our funders, to build the game into a much more comprehensive game that could promote play for much longer. So those were the key objectives in developing the game, to basically make it much more motivating so that we could engage players over a prolonged period. And the period that we're aiming for is based on other research that's been done in populations affected by other neurodevelopmental disorders, where they've used not games but computerized training to try to train things like memory. And they've shown that if you play for about 20 to 30 minutes a day on most days over 5 weeks, then you can see an improvement in memory in everyday life. So we were aiming for that sort of ballpark figure of engagement with our game. And so I'm going to show you a clip, and then I'm going to talk about some of the things that we did to sort of make the game better and why. So, but I'll show you the clip first. One of the really important things that we did was recognise that it's really motivating to have control over your own gameplay and have choice. And of course we know that having control is definitely important for people with Prader-Willi Syndrome, perhaps even more important. So we made sure that players could select from a number of different players, and they could select from a number of those different Zorblixes that gives them feedback. And we also then built in a number of systems to motivate ongoing play. So you saw those achievements pop up, like flawless, and those are built into a system where the number of achievements that you can get is at the top of the scale, and every time you get a new achievement, you can see yourself climbing up that scale. You see we created this sort of map, and that's just one of 12 different worlds that you can play the game in, and so it creates a clear sense of progression through the map. And each time you finish a level, you get an immediate reward, as in the Zorblix pops up, and then you win a star. And the in-game stars you can use to sort of buy things in the game that are special skills, like more power, more speed. And then, really importantly, there's certain secret levels where when you finish that level, you win an atom, and your atom counter goes up to a particular point where when you get to the top of that counter, you win an external prize. So it's something that we agreed on with all of our participants on at the beginning, so they told us the kind of prize that they wanted, and then when they reached the top of the scale, then they won that actual prize. Another thing that we did in this version of the game was to build it so that it's better at training switching. So I mentioned the sort of core dynamic that involves switching, because sometimes you have to collect one thing and sometimes you have to collect another thing, but that's quite rudimentary really. Actually, we know that switching in the brain is supported by a range of different cognitive skills, and so it's possible that developing those supporting cognitive skills could help support the development of switching. So we had in the game special features that helped us to train those supportive cognitive skills. And I think I've got a video, this one. I just want to play you that to show you one of those supportive skills. So you saw there a cloud appeared over the figure, so you have to remember what goes underneath, what keeps coming under the cloud, and that puts demands on your how you update things in your memory, which is really important for supporting task switching. And also when the creatures lost their colour, you have to remember which colour they were, and so that's also training this working memory updating, which again is important for supporting task switching. And we had a number of different features like that could flexibly push the skills that support task switching in the game. We've finished our trial of this game now, but we haven't analysed the results yet, because literally I've had a very hectic run of conferences over the last 2 weeks, and we just got the final set of results in just before I went. But what I can do is talk about some of the engagement profile, because as I said, we were aiming to encourage people to play over 5 weeks quite regularly, and so it was really important that we could achieve that, because without that sort of level of engagement, we didn't expect to be able to have the positive effects that we wanted. So you can see here, these are just people that, it was a placebo-controlled design, but these are people that started not in the placebo group, so in the game group, and that's just the number of minutes that they played. So the red line there shows our target gameplay, which is 20 to 30 minutes a day, most days over 5 weeks. So you can see that most people are reaching the target or almost reaching the target. And we've got some players that are massively exceeding the targets. So the green lines that are really high up, those equate to about 40 minutes, on average 40 minutes every day over the 5 weeks. So I've spoken to families after so it was placebo controlled, so we don't know the actual results, but this is after they're not blind anymore, so they already know which game they were playing. And I've spoken to families about if they have noticed any differences. And I would say from those anecdotal reports, it's the sort of variable experiences. There's some families that say, yes, definitely, we think we've noticed an improvement in resistance to change, changes that the person wouldn't have been able to deal with before. We've found that actually she's surprised us, he or she has surprised us in how well they've dealt with the change. But other families have said, no, look, really with resistance to change, we haven't noticed anything. Perhaps we haven't had the opportunity to notice anything because actually we structure things quite a lot, and we haven't, it hasn't been that long since we've been playing the game. There hasn't really been much opportunity to see a change in resistance to change. But we have noticed some more subtle things, like perhaps a change in sort of willingness to persevere with things when they get hard, because actually the game pushes players really well. It's really adaptive, so it starts off really easy, but then it pushes players just at the point where it's always just achievable, but they have to try really hard to make it be just achievable. So some families have said, look, that pushing that it's done, there were several times when they just thought, oh, I can't do it anymore, I'm giving up, and stopped it for that day, but then went back to the game the next day and then really surprised themselves because they managed to achieve it. And they noticed that sort of being helpful for other aspects of life as well. So, I would love to let you know about the actual results of the trial once we've analysed them. But just to finish then, moving on to the early intervention that we're working on at the moment. So the idea is still behind this task switching difficulties being linked to resistance to change. Actually, there's some really interesting evidence from typically developing youngsters so around the age of 6 to 8 years, that's the age when task switching normally develops really quickly. And if children of that age are exposed to more flexibility in their routines and activities, then their task switching skill seems to develop quicker. So this idea between having exposure to flexibility and, if you like, practice of changes in the environment is actually helping to develop task switching skill. And in our work with people with Prader-Willi Syndrome, and there's limits to this work because it's just interview-based studies, and there's various problems with that, but nevertheless, there's some evidence to suggest that families who report that actually from an early age they've never been the sort of family to have really strict routines, and they've tried to sort of implement some level of flexibility in the children's lives. Those families that report then this sort of increased flexibility or less rigidity at an early age, around sort of the start of primary school, at a later age, say secondary school age and beyond, those individuals tend to show less resistance to change. So our idea is that could there be this important balance between making sure that individuals have enough structure to avoid problems with anxiety at the moment, because obviously we know that too much change at the moment can increase anxiety, so we definitely need enough structure, but could there also be an important need for having enough flexibility so that children get the right opportunities to practice the task switching and make sure it develops properly? So in our flexible scheduling project, what we're trying to do is create a tool collaboratively with parents and caregivers to strike this right balance between structure and flexibility. And we completely recognise that actually some families are already doing this much better than we could possibly recommend, and that's why we're working with families to develop this tool. But at the same time, we recognise that for other families it's really important, it's really difficult to try and find the right balance, and so what we're trying to do is develop a tool that will make that easier. So what we've done is we've spoken to several families and also professionals who work with children, and this is children aged, I've put there 6 to 12, but actually that's wrong, it's aged 4 to 12. And we've talked about current resistance to change, current strategies to deal with change, current routines, and families' advice around this sort of balancing strategy. And from that, we've developed a number of what we're calling design criteria. And I just want to pick up on what I think is perhaps the most important one, and that is that families have said, look, if you're creating an approach where ultimately I need to impose more flexibility on my child than they would sort of have if I just left them to their own devices, then you need to make sure that I don't have responsibility for that in my child's eyes. Because if I'm the one saying, look, you need to change this, we need to do this in a different way, it's not going to be perceived well by my child because they won't have the control. So the way we thought of to tackle that problem is to build it into an approach that looks like a game from the child's point of view. And so it's the game and the sort of randomness of the game that's telling the child this is where you put flexibility in. And so then, even though the game's telling them, because they have control over the game, then the child has ultimate control in their own eyes. So ultimately what we've got in mind, and I'd love the opportunity to talk to you about this over the course of this weekend, but this is just a summary of the sort of elements that we have in mind. And basically what we're thinking is that families would make a plan that includes the overall structure of activities, and there would be a web-based system for accessing that plan that the child could look at what as much or as little as they like, depending on the needs of the child. But importantly, at key points in that plan, there would be a symbol to say, okay, this is when it needs to be flexible. And at the point when the thing needs to be flexible, the parent would get a reminder saying, oh, this is when you programmed in the flexibility, and then the parent would hand over the phone or the tablet to the child, and the child would play the game. And the game would just look like basically a wheel rolling, selecting from a number of different options that include the typical option, but also alternatives, and importantly the alternative that the parent has selected, which is something that's flexible. And so just to end, I want to show you a quick video of a really early prototype of that idea that we've got in mind. So, of course, that's just a prototype. We definitely want visuals in the long term, and that involves like 5 different options, and for many children that would be way too many options. But that's the idea. It's about making it game-like, this flexibility that the child would get. And then ultimately, if we can do that and we can show that that approach could increase children's flexibility, then we put that into a sort of bigger evaluation study where we'd be able to test this idea that if we can increase flexibility at an early age, that can increase skill and development in task switching and decrease the development of resistance to change. So, quickly, thank you to everyone. And I can see Jackie waiting there. So, Siobhan, I can't see right now. Oh yeah, Siobhan at the back is with me today, and Siobhan has been pivotal in helping to think about this flexible scheduling idea, and a lot of the ideas behind the design are Siobhan's. Other ideas behind the design are Alex Sauerberg, who is our engineer who's helping us with the technical design, and he's going to be here later to sit on the behaviour session that Siobhan and I are running, so that he can hear families' perspectives on behaviour, etc. And just thank you to everyone in my team, but most importantly to all of the families. And I know that some of the families and professionals who've been involved in our research are here today, and without them none of this could happen. So that's where the biggest thank you goes.